Most of my stuff at first appearance is erotic. I want to see people read more into it than just what's on the surface, which to me gets you to sentiment. Shibari gives me more flexibility to add more interest to the images. I've almost always selected my jobs so that I'm free to do my photography. So it was once I started traveling, I had time to go out and explore, that I started actually photographing people. And at that point, I realized that I could use Shibari to tell some stories about the entanglements of life, that you're responsible for your own life and the life you build, you own it. The stuff that happens to you that you don't have any control over. For me, they kind of go hand in hand. It's a balancing. Once you have all the wraps on the body, I'll tie the rope through the rig that I use to pick them up. With all those wraps, it's almost like they're being hugged.
Welcome to Angel City Culture Quest, where art, social justice, and the environment meet in Los Angeles. I am your host, Melina Paris, and I welcome you to this episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Angel City Culture Quest. Today, we are having a very interesting conversation with artist Reidar Schopp. Hi, Reidar. How are you today?
I'm doing excellent. And you?
Good, good. I'm so glad to have you here today.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
I'm going to read a little bit about artist, photographer, Reidar, and tell you a little bit about his bio and history, and then we're going to get started. Reidar's goal is to create stories that elicit an emotional attraction or repulsion. Images that appear specific to the viewers, but for each viewer, the story differs. Reidar says, I prefer invented stories on imaginary stages with flashes of surrealism and conceptualism. The joy and inspiration is not in the initial idea. Rather, it is the process of finding the models, assembling the sets, and working through a collaborative process that generates the final image to be presented to those willing to look. Reidar was introduced to photography by his mother, Jean E. Dobbs Schopp, a freelance photographer who also worked for the News Pilot. At the age of 8, he accompanied his mom on shoots, including weddings. Initially, his job was to carry the power pack that fired her strobes, which he swears was equal to the weight of half a lead car battery. As he got older, Reidar would load the 4x5 film into the holders for her Graflex, the quintessential press camera, then the second shooter, and eventually the primary shooter. Early on, 2 events happened which had great influence on Reidar and his work. First, in college at the California Maritime Academy, Reidar was editor of the yearbook and the president of the Photo Media Club. He was supplied with all the film he could shoot and had access to a darkroom. That's where his photography really took off because on the training ship, he traveled to various Pacific islands like Hawaii, New Zealand, New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, which are all known for their biodiversity and beauty. The next event was Reidar's discovery of photographer William Mortensen. Reidar wrote, his imagery was the first to stop me in my tracks. I loved the dark undertones, the stories he was telling. The mid-career images of Mortensen were highly manipulated and were stunning. Although my mom taught me the technical aspects, composition, cropping, it was Mortensen who broke open the artistic possibilities of photography as the basis of my artist voice. Once I completed my studio in 2006, I was finally able to pursue the style of imagery unfettered. Reidar's current series necessitated his learning of Japanese rope bondage, including suspensions. These series, titled Renaissance Shibari and Vases, are his latest avenue of exploration into surrealism. Lots of interesting stuff, Reidar. Right now, I'd like to unfold Mortensen a little bit further in terms of your work. In the Smithsonian link that you had sent me earlier, what struck me about Mortensen were 2 things. His borrowing of techniques from painting and other art forms to manipulate photos, and second, his interest in the collective unconscious and archetypes, or symbolism and patterns, which are shared across cultures and generations. This influenced Mortenson's choice of subject matter and his composition. And in his book, The Command to Look, Mortenson argued that images should be constructed along certain patterns, such as the S shape, triangle, and diagonal, among others, which activated the brain's primitive fear response, and that this initial alarm should be followed up with subjects that appealed to three basic human emotions: sex, sentiment, and wonder. So I'm curious, did Mortenson's theory on patterns influence how you construct any of your series, such as Shibari, for instance?
Oh, absolutely. As you've seen, most of my stuff at first appearance is erotic. So that would be Mortenson's sex. But as we talked earlier, is that even though it's erotic, I want to see people read more into it than just what's on the surface, which to me gets you to sentiment. And now I'm trying to remember what the definition of wonder was, because it was different from what you'd see in the dictionary. But where he's talking about the S curve and diagonals and stuff, it actually works really well with Shibari because the ropes suspending the people are always diagonal. So the eye will lead from the body up the ropes to where the suspension is happening. And then, of course, the body placements usually are diagonal. It's actually hard to get a person perfectly flat. Whereas, let's say my box series, there's some diagonals in there, but you're constrained by the square. Shibari gives me more flexibility to add more interest to the images. Hopefully that's not too rambling.
No, not at all. Not at all. So those archetypes are interesting, the symbolism and patterns, and the exhibition of your work at Collage. It was last year, but I don't remember what month it was.
August, September.
Oh, it was, wow, a year ago exactly. It did elicit emotion. You mentioned wonder, so it elicited wonder for sure. I did see a lot of symbolism in many of the works. I didn't always know exactly what it was, but it just seemed to me that there were things much deeper than what was presented on the surface, and you just had to gaze a little longer and contemplate. So before photographing Shibari, you had a couple different careers. First with Getty Oil Company, until everyone who worked for Getty lost their jobs when Texaco bought them. Then you went into finance, which created a lull in your photography. And then in 1997, you went into financial consulting and you had clients all over the world. So at the end of the workday, you usually skipped dinner to go sightseeing with your camera. It's noteworthy that you did photography projects on every continent, except for Antarctica and Africa, though you made it to Africa later on a month-long photo safari. During this time, you were photographing landscapes and some abstract work as well. Currently, your profession is as an architect for computer programming. So is your photography a serious hobby or a passion?
Oh, absolutely a passion. I've almost always selected my jobs so that I'm free to do my photography. So, as you said, my photography was in a lull in the 80s because I was doing finance, I had small kids. I would get my son and daughter to do some modeling, but my son never liked it. And my daughter grew to where she just didn't want to be bothered by it anymore.
Yeah.
So it was once I started traveling when I became a financial consultant, then I wasn't home. So I had time to go out and explore. At the time, I was doing landscapes. It probably wasn't until early 2000s that I started actually photographing people. And being on the road, you can't build sets or anything. But it was my initial experience of getting models and doing location shoots with them.
I see. So it opened up a little bit more in the photography world for you.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite location of scenery that you had photographed during this time when you were traveling?
I love London. I've had multiple clients in London and just the architecture, it's kind of Gothic revival, which is my taste. And so put out a casting call, let's say on Model Mayhem or something, and people would reach out. You'd meet them for coffee initially just to discuss concepts, find out what they're comfortable with. And if we're both good, then we'd go out to these various locations and shoot.
So when were you introduced to Shibari?
Oh, so back in probably 2007, I enjoyed the goth club Hell that was in Hollywood.
The Goth Club.
Yeah.
Yeah.
GOPH, not GOLF.
Totally different.
Yeah. When I was working in Perth, they had a club called Sin. I had no idea what it was, but there was a long line. It's like, well, let's go check it out. And the owner let me in with my cameras, and it was just a totally different world than what I was used to.
Mm.
So I did quite a few images, Gothic images in Australia. So when I came back from that project, I started photographing for Club Hell, which was, I don't know, 2007, 2011 or something like that. And I found all kinds of people that wanted to model for me. So that
Oh,
was
wow.
my initial way of finding people. And I had just finished building my studio then. So I had places for them to come to rather than shooting in the alleys or anything like that in Hollywood or LA.
Yeah. Yeah. Much better. So you noted that Shibari turned into a series. A series
Yes.
was birthed, and you saw a painting at the Ireland National Museum.
Yes. So even though I have known people who've done Shibari for a decade before, it wasn't until I was talking to a model, Stephanie, where I presented her a list of things to shoot. And at the end, she goes, well, I've always wanted to do Shibari. And if I could do that. So I told her, I can photograph it. And I know people who tie. So yes, we can create that image. So we brought her in. We had the person that knows Shibari. He came in with all of his equipment. And in my studio, I do have a rig to lift people up. I've had that because of this Charlie Belmer from the Club Hell needed a place to do his Shibari and have me photograph it. But Charlie had passed away, so we brought in, he goes by Sir Finn. So he did the tying of Stephanie in my studio. And that photo, I think, is still one of the best. She's in a yoga position, kind of elevated above a table with all the flowers and stuff. And she just looks like she's at a little piece. But to get to that photo, there was the struggle to get her balanced and things like that. But overall, the tying wasn't really that different from what I had done in the maritime industry. So after that shoot, Stephanie said that, well, she wants to keep doing it because it was a great experience for her. And she just felt so comfortable being on the rope. So Sir Finn became our mentor and taught us how to do Shibari. And I think that was maybe about a year that I went with him. And then eventually I wanted to do suspensions. So I moved to the Long Beach Shibari Dojo and started learning suspensions.
Nice. So Shibari is a follow-on to your boxed series, you said,
Yes.
which we'll also discuss. Both series have meanings behind them. Can you describe each of those for us?
Yeah. So the Box series official title is Box, The Life We Build for Ourselves. And that series was kind of formed in my head for a specific image in 1980, where I was at the Maritime Academy and we were waiting for Saturday Night Live to come on. And they had a news clip of a man who collected Barbie dolls in their original boxes. And he had a couple of rooms just lined with all these dolls on shelves. And he would excitedly go around the rooms and pointing to all these Barbies and explaining about them on this newscast. And almost immediately, it's like, I need to do that as a photo and have all these Barbie dolls on a shelf. But instead of Barbie dolls, I want people's parts, stuff like that in little boxes on shelves behind one of my friends who actually looked kind of evil. But so it's going to be a big collage project.
Wow.
So that was the starting of the box series.
Could you describe a still life from the
Oh, for the
I
Shibari.
yeah.
So we did the suspension, and Stephanie wanted to learn more about it. But I didn't have the series of Shibari in my head yet about the entanglements of life. And it was probably 2 months after having the suspension with Stephanie, our family went to Ireland. And I went to Ireland's National Museum, and there was this Renaissance painting. Don't remember the painter, but it was a huge painting, and it was a table full of flowers, foods, sterling silver, glass goblets, and food, but they had a goose, deer, and chicken pended from the rafters of the building and hanging above the table. And at that point, I realized that I could use shibari and the Renaissance style to tell some stories, and that I would substitute the dead animals with people.
There you go.
So that was the start of the Renaissance series. And then the base series, which is kind of a tie-on, is I tie the models and then we insert flowers so that they become a human base. So usually I will do both those shoots at the same session with models.
You described the meaning behind the box series, and I do want to get back to the shibari series.
Yeah. So as the box series is that you're responsible for your own life and the life you build, you own it. The shibari series is more about the stuff that happens to you that you don't have any control over. So it's the entanglements of life.
Mm,
And for me, they kind of go hand in hand.
right.
And personally, I think people are understanding the shibari series easier than they do the box series.
Yeah, it's relatable. So, can you explain the concept behind shibari for us and a little bit about how you find your models?
So shibari started in Japan, as far as I can understand, in the 1600s, maybe earlier, but Japan didn't have a lot of medals for stuff. So instead of creating bindings for criminals, they would tie ropes. And the interesting thing to me was the higher up in society you were, you would get more ornate bindings if you were a criminal. So if you're in the lowest caste, they just tie you however it was. But as they escalate up through your caste, they become quite elaborate. They were also tied so that if you struggled, the bindings would get tighter and tighter on you.
Wow.
So that's how the whole thing started. And eventually it became, and I'm not sure when, but I know at least by the 1920s, it had moved into the erotic zone. And after World War II, when the US Army was in there, they would see some of these performances and they brought it home to the US for shibari, but it became different in the US because they didn't really know all the details behind it. Although now with the interest in shibari, for example, the Long Beach Shibari Dojo, we just had a Japanese professional shibari tyer come in to do some displays and how they do it in Japan. Although my teacher in suspensions is also Japanese, so I didn't see a lot of differences to it, but probably depends on who your teacher is to where if you see significant differences or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And where do you find your models?
So I used to use Model Mayhem for my casting calls, especially when I'm in foreign countries. But currently, well, at least in the US, it's almost word of mouth is how it started, or at the goth clubs.
Oh,
And because I was the lead photographer at some of these goth clubs, people started looking at the images that I was creating. And then it was much easier to get them to participate in the series than, let's say, conventional models. So that's why my series, most models are tattooed and things like that. And usually for goth, most people are, I think they're extroverts.
yeah.
So it's easy for them to come in and play in my series. I haven't been to a goth club in years, though, but I'm still in touch with most of the people. I give them what my current concept is, and then they say whether they want to join or not. And then they'll refer other people to me. And then for the shibari specifically, I get a lot of people from the Long Beach Shibari Dojo. I can't think of how many I've photographed through there.
If you're just tuning in, today we're speaking with artist, photographer, Reidar Schopp. Thank you for listening. Hello, folks. This is your host, Melina Paris. As Angel City Culture Quest begins its 4th year, we are dedicated to bringing you quest-worthy inspiration. With so much to cover in the Harbor region and Los Angeles in art, books, film, music, activism, and more. It's a challenge that I'm honored to embrace, discovering and bringing you the inspired stories and works of many different artists. A major highlight of 2024 was to present our video episode in front of a live audience, Consciousness Through the Lens of Abstraction, featuring esteemed artists Marie Thibault and June Edmonds. You can find that on our YouTube. That was a huge push, and we did it with the help of your support. I'm so grateful. Exciting developments are happening. Stay informed by liking, subscribing, and following our updates, featuring more great artists and authors, the latest in important documentaries, filmmaking, and more. And if you're able, please join me in this quest with your support. Think of it as a cultural tip jar. I would be honored to have your support to further my ability to bring you the powerful works of these artists and others and the cultural content that you crave. To donate, please go to patreon.com/Angel City Culture Quest. There you can find all of our past episodes. Thank you.
Time is valuable and good. Please don't direct me to the bed. I'm giving you a minute or else I'll turn my back.
Can you talk a little bit more about working with that dojo?
Yeah, so it's owned by Steve and Chris. They have this huge space with different places to do different tyings. And Chris saw my photos on Instagram. And so she reached to her husband and told him that he needs to reach out to me and see what I've been creating. So he did, and we've actually become friends. And of course, he is my mentor now. But for the Long Beach Shibari Dojo, like today is a rope jam. It starts at 2:00. And then usually I go and photograph it, where they'll have a bunch of people come in and watch how suspensions are done and things like that. He also, in this space, he's a painter. So he also will have people come in and he teaches them how to paint. And a lot of times the models are suspended and tied because a lot of people have never experienced that. So he's teaching them, the emphasis is the ropes, and then the models aren't really that detailed, but the ropes, they're to paint that detail.
I see. I could see where that would be really kind of drawing people in to understand, even though it's a painting, but it's a way of understanding the process a little bit by looking at the detail of the knots, the way they're grouped together. And you were talking about your plans for a mobile.
So Steve and I were talking about how we'll do this crucifix suspension. We can talk about that later. But that triggered the idea in him is, how can we balance people who are suspended to make a mobile? So you have a person up here, but that person is tied to this person. And I'm sure you've seen mobiles before.
Yeah.
It's a balancing. And what we're trying to work out is, because people can't be suspended for very long, because even though I tie a comfortable tie, to have a person suspended and another person suspended from them and then another person suspended from them, we're trying to figure out how to make the tie quickly and get them suspended so that we can get the photo. And at this point, I keep thinking there's so much pain that it's impossible, but I like trying to solve for the impossible. So we're still working out how that's going to happen.
Lots of ropes and lots of binding.
Yes. And then, of course, how to pick up all these people.
Yeah.
Because that'll be quite a bit of weight.
Very delicate balance. What do you find people's reasons are for wanting to do a Shibari photo shoot?
People have seen it before and they're curious and they want to try it. Like Stephanie, for example, the first person I photographed for the series. And then others get tied all the time. They just love the confinement of the ties and stuff.
You said you make them comfortable too.
Yeah, so it depends if you want an erotic tie, which tends to be more painful if a person wants that. But you can't stay in that tie for very because of pain. But because I'm photographing, I want it to be a beautiful tie, but I need them to be able to be suspended for, let's say, a half an hour. And the rig I have, I can spin people and move them into different positions. So even though they're tied and they can't necessarily move themselves, I can rotate them. I can picture it in my head, and I'm trying to get it into words, is that most of the time you'll have two chest harnesses, you'll have a hip harness, and then you tie the legs and hands. Usually it's a rope that's wrapped twice. That tends to be painful. So I'll wrap them with 8 wraps. So that way it's a wider base so that it's far more comfortable. I keep relating it to a hammock, but everybody just knows it's a single tie, but it's just a bunch of grids on the rope. But the more rope you have, the more comfortable it is. But that's not a pretty tie to tie a bunch of little diamonds all over the person. So it's usually 8 wraps, and that's enough to keep them comfortable. And then, of course, once you have all the wraps on the body, then I'll tie the rope through the rig that I use to pick them up. And with all those wraps, it's almost like they're being hugged.
That's nice.
I'll have to invite you in the future for one of these.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yes, I would love to see that. As I was listening to you talk earlier about the models and the goth clubs, it almost sounds like there's a culture for it. There's a culture for shibari.
Yes.
That's nice. Just briefly, is there a way that you would describe this culture of people that like this art?
I don't know how a lot of people get introduced to it. Like I said, I was introduced to it through a goth club, but there's people that go to dungeons, and in there, people can be caged, they can be all kinds of different things. You get flogged, whipped, or what have you. But in those clubs, there's also people know how to tie as well. So a lot of the people seem to be into the BDSM scene. And again, a lot of my models will be from that. I have porn actresses that model for me.
It's a wide variety.
Like I said, I've had some people who've just wanted to know what it's like. So we'll do the tie and suspension. But most of the people are in the scene.
So let's talk about the boxed series.
So we already talked about the news segment.
Yeah.
So with that, it always was in the back of my mind, especially since, we're talking 1980, but I didn't actually start creating it until 2007. So it fermented for a long time. But when I got my own studio, I started playing with that series. Well, it actually wasn't supposed to even be a series. It was supposed to be a collage for one photograph. All these people and pieces of people in all these boxes on a shelf with, I'm going to say, my friend who is very thin, but he was scruff and he had this evil look. And so he was going to be the psycho killer who was the collector of all these people. And one of my model friends, she had images of herself in a gallery named Flash Alley Studio. And that was in San Pedro on Pacific. And she told me about this gallery. I had never known about it. And she also talked to the owner saying that they need to meet me and to look at the images I'm creating, since again, it was supposed to be a single collage. So I showed up with about 20 of the photos, and he was just kind of flipping through them. And the main thing is I had this nightmare photo of a woman standing up against the box, and this guy was kind of on his knees below her, but he just had this evil look. Joe looked at this, but he flipped it 90 degrees from what I had and goes, "No, you've got the wrong angle." And he goes, "This is how it has to be, where she's on her back and he's hovering over her. So it looks like he's having a nightmare." That collage, it was the one that he had. There was 4 of them. So when he saw that, he goes, "I want this as a series. Don't do the collage, and bring me a bunch more of these things." And then he gave me a solo exhibition in like December and January, starting in 2010. So that was the first time the box series was displayed. And it was Joe and his partner, Sid, who actually wrote the artist statement because they didn't like how I wrote it. And Sid was a huge fan of Shakespeare's sonnets. So it was quite interesting on how he wrote it. And I wish I still had a copy of it. I have no idea what happened to it.
Oh, I hope it pops up one day.
Yeah. But yeah, he used words for the guy in San Francisco of he was gesticulating around the room. And it's like, what the hell is gesticulating? So I had to go look it up. And all right, people's vocabulary is probably better than mine, but it was quite a piece of artwork that he did in language that I could have never done.
Pulling it all together.
Yes.
So you had the exhibit at Collage last year, and it included mostly work from your boxed series with a bit of shibari, but also some landscapes. There was a lot of great reactions from that exhibit. Everybody was really surprised and in wonder, I think.
Yeah. Some of the people there have seen the box series for quite a while. but the shibari was fairly new to them.
Yeah.
But because the box series, I mean, it's been shown in St. Louis and other places. So I have lots of prints of that in inventory. So that's why probably more than half the show was the box series because I have the big prints of it. The shibari series, well, in the box series is so far is about 350 images. The shibari series right now is only about 3 dozen. I started it, like I said, a couple years ago. So I still have lots of concepts to pull together on that.
I want to let people know we have several other series from your photography, which we're going to include a list of in our show notes for people to check out. Lastly, you have 2 projects coming up. Can you please tell us about them because they sound so unique and extremely interesting?
So I'm with the Palos Verdes Art Center with a subgroup called PATA, which is Photographers and Digital Artists Group. And we did a trip to the Getty Museum a couple years ago where we went to look at a photographer who was basically confined to her bedroom. I think it was because of illness, but she was a photographer, so she was photographing the curtains, shadows, and stuff in her room. So that was the purpose of going to Getty to look at that series, but that didn't take very long to look at. So my wife, Gigi, and I were roaming to Getty, and I came across a bust that was just so different from any other bust that you'd seen. Usually the bust is glamorizing the person of whoever it is, whether it's an emperor or king or queens, whatever. This one, the guy was kind of look, the muscles are plunging from the throat. His lips are pursed really tight, but he had a sad expression. His eyes were closed. He was very strenuous. And it's like, you don't see those kind of busts. And I was just fascinated by it. So the artist's name was Franz Xavier Messerschmidt. He was from Austria in the late 1700s. So doing research, I bought a book about him, and it seems like he was schizophrenic and he was creating all these busts, and there's over 80 of them. He didn't name them. And it was to scare away the demons. And when he would move, all of these things would come with him. And for years, he was just creating all these. In the meantime, he was doing commissions for the emperor and empress of Austria and things like that. The person who bought him after his death was using him in a carnival show. So he just had them all on display. So he's the one who named all these. And that's where the vexed man came from, because they were trying to assign names to some of these. And so you'll find one like the flatulent man. It's the hanged man, the drowned man. So they were just coming up with names for the carnival show. He didn't consider them works of art.
They're amazing. They talked about he worked with the marbles characteristics to create the wrinkles in these people's faces.
Yeah, and not all of them were marble. He did stuff in metal, and I find it just totally fascinating. Like Mortensen stopped me in my tracks. The Vex Man did the same thing. So I did try to get the PATA group in to do this as a series, although they enjoyed hanging out in the studio and everybody making funny faces. It just didn't really catch with them. So I decided that I'm just going to do it on my own. Of course, Bondo.
Yeah.
Heaven forbid I should get his last name right. But he's been my major encouragement to get this series started.
And you have the one image of him doing a sort of vexed man expression.
He's great. His face is elastic enough that he can pull off a bunch of great looks.
And what is the second one? The Christ of St. John of the Cross by Salvador Dali.
Yes. That I hit, I don't know. I've made so many trips to New York, but I like going into the Met. At the Met, you make this turn down to one of the next galleries, and this painting is quite large, and it's right at the end. So you make the turn, and it's just right there. And again, another painting that stopped me in my tracks. So it's painted by Salvador Dali, and the crucifix is up in the air like it's flying over the earth with St. Jerome crucified on it. And of course, the difficulty is trying to get that as a photograph. So again, it's been something that's been fermenting in my head. But now that I know shibari and suspensions, it's like, I know how I could do this. I have 2 rigs in my studio for suspensions. And well, in my house, I think you've noted the crucifixion shot that I have of a woman on the cross with tape over her mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the cross. It's 13 feet tall. I don't know, 7 feet for the arm. So what we're going to do, and of course, Long Beach Shibari Dojo. So Chris and Steve are going to assist with this. And I've already got 4 or 5 models want to be suspended on the cross while it's 10 feet in the air and it's horizontal. So we're going to tie them to the underside of the cross and then lift them 10 feet up in the air. I've got a huge airplane fan that would be behind me so that it looks like they're flying through the air, so their hair would be blowing back.
That's going to be so wild. That's going to be
And
great.
I keep thinking I might need one of those blow up mattresses at the bottom just in case.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
But that cross is a couple hundred pounds. So we'll see how we can do it. But we'll have a couple of people there for safety. I'll probably end up putting sawhorses. I've got heavy duty sawhorses. I'm restoring the house that I'm in. So make sure that it can catch each corner of the cross. So the 4 points with the air mattress below. So if anything happens, and my rigs can support over 2,000 pounds. So this should be safe, but this isn't like any other suspension where if they fall, they're only 3 feet off the ground and there's a little mat there, but nothing will fall on them. This is much more complex and risky.
So you need the reinforcements and the protection for sure.
Yeah, and I still have to climb to the ceiling to put the backdrop up, which is the hardest thing because you've seen how high the ceiling is. So I'll probably have to build scaffolding to get the backdrop up.
To crawl over there. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. A
Hold on.
project.
Yeah,
So
I'm thinking I'll just do a
inspiring.
green screen and then just Photoshop a backdrop in, but we'll see.
You
It's
got
still-
options.
Yeah, it's still rolling around in my head. But models are lined up, the assistants are lined up. It's just the last finishing touches for safety and things like that.
That's great. You wanted to mention about Malaga Cove too, the outdoor exhibition there.
Yeah, just wrapped up for the Malaga Cove Library. I had 2 seascapes in that, but that came down a month ago. But the second weekend of every month, I have a tent with some of my artwork on display and the flip bins with a third of the box series, most of the Shibari series, as well as lots of the landscapes and things that I've done.
And those are prints that are available for people.
Yes.
Okay.
The Malaga Cove runs May through October. So there's
Nice.
2 left for this year.
Okay. So people can check you out there.
Yes.
And where else can they find you?
I will be in a group show at Crafted. It's in September and October. If anybody follows me on Instagram, I'll post the specific dates on that. And of course, it'll be on Facebook as well. And I'll send emails out to people who are on my list.
That's great. And what is your Instagram?
It's RLSFOTO, which is also my trademark. So if you Google it, you'll find Twitter and Facebook and my website, but it's down and I still have to go get it reclaimed back to my name.
This is fascinating to talk to you and find out more about your work and all the details with the Shibari. And I encourage people to check your work out because it's fascinating. It's beautiful. There's a lot of underlying ideas, messages, like you said, with the Shibari series and the box series. And it's beautiful work. So I'm really happy to have you here today to discuss it all and to share it with everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.